Okay, today you're going to be reading a very important poem. It's also very emotional and touching, called The Ballad of Birmingham. And I usually don't give this to my students to read until after they've read The Watsons Go to Birmingham, because now that you've read that book, you really understand a whole lot more about what this poem is about. So I'm going to read this little introduction to you. Just follow along with me, and then we're going to talk about the poem itself. The 1960s were a dangerous decade for America, especially if you lived in the southern half of the country. See, the South was still under Jim Crow laws which legalized racial segregation. As a result, marches, demonstrations, and protests sprung up all over the country in support of ending these laws and restoring civil rights to every American. Not everyone was on board, though. This movement was met with some pretty heavy backlash by folks who didn't want things to change. Birmingham, Alabama was in the center of the storm, and many protests and marches were held in its streets. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were on the scene, encouraging demonstrations for peace. Even children joined in to march for equality. So, many Americans were shocked and horrified when, in response to these demonstrations, white supremacists bombed a church and caused the death of 4 young girls. It's difficult for anyone to respond to such a tragedy, but Dudley Randall, an African American poet and writer of the time, put his sorrow into the words "The Ballad of Birmingham." The simple, rhyming poem lends itself well to music, so it was instantly made into a folk classic. Because of the simple style, the heartbreaking subject matter, and the easy to remember lyrics, Ballad of Birmingham became Randall's most well known work, one that has been memorialized and put to song in order to keep the spirit of equality alive. Don't be fooled, the ballad's simplicity is part of its carefully planned effect. Dudley Randall wanted the poem's message to be easily shared, and he figured having a simple and rhyming style might be the best way to go about that. Much like a catchy tune that doesn't get out of your head, his lines are easy to memorize. And, like the tragic images and history of the poem, they're hard to forget. You should care about this poem because it reminds us of a dark, dark period in American history so that we might never repeat that same horror again. Okay, so we're going to read the poem in just a minute, but I want us, before we read the poem, I want to ask you this question. So, some of the moments in the Watsons Go to Birmingham are very serious and really hard to read about and to watch, especially when we read chapter 14, which was the church bombing. But it's important that we read, even though it's sad, it's important that we read about these things and still learn about them. But I want you to think about why it's important that we remember sad, tragic moments from our history. Why do we remember Dr. King? We know that he died, and that's sad. Why do we remember that? And I'm going to put my thoughts down, and you can pause the video and put your own thoughts, and or you can listen to what I think and then put your thoughts down. It's your choice, but tell me why you think it's important to remember these sad, tragic moments. I think it is important to remember sad, tragic, that's a good word to include, moments from history because people risked and lost their lives for our freedoms. I think if we didn't remember the people like the 4 little girls and Dr. King, if we didn't remember them, um, that would be another tragedy. It's important to remember these people because they gave up their lives for our freedoms. And that's why I think it's important to remember these moments. All right. If you haven't answered the question, pause this video and then come on back and we'll move into the poem. So the poem is titled The Ballad of Birmingham, written by Dudley Randall, and he lived from 1914 to 2000. I want you to pay attention to the imagery, what you can kind of see in your mind. Um, In my mind, I see scenes from the movie that we watched right after we finished the book. The movie, especially the movie with the church bombing scene with Kenny walking through in slow motion. I kind of see this, and the speaker of the poem that you'll hear some voices, as it's like the narrator of the poem, reminds me a lot of Joetta from the Watsons Go to Birmingham. Mother dear, may I go downtown instead of out to play and march the streets of Birmingham in a freedom march today? No, baby, no, you may not go, for the dogs are fierce and wild, and clubs and hoses, guns and jails aren't good for a little child. But mother, I won't be alone. Other children will go with me and march the streets of Birmingham to make our country free. No, baby, no, you may not go, for I fear those guns will fire. But you may go to church instead and sing in the children's choir. She has combed and brushed her night dark hair, and bathed rose petals sweet, and drawn white gloves on her small brown hands, and white shoes on her feet. The mother smiled to know that her child was in the sacred place, but that smile was the last smile to come upon her face. For when she heard the explosion, her eyes grew wet and wild. She raced through the streets of Birmingham calling for her child. She clawed through bits of glass and brick, then lifted out a shoe. Oh, here's the shoe my baby wore. But baby, where are you? So you can see that conversation between a mother and child. And the author of this poem wrote this in honor of the four little girls that actually did lose their lives that day. So if you want to go back and reread the poem on your own, it's short enough that you can do that. And sometimes it's important to reread poems a couple of times so that you can get every little bit of imagery out or meaning or emotion. And it's okay to do that. You can pause the video and go back and reread it on your own. And when you're ready, we'll continue with the assignment. So one thing I'd like you to do, and I asked you to do this as you were reading the poem with me, is to go back and highlight some examples of imagery. Now, imagery are words that help you see and hear, and sometimes even smell details of a text, in this case, a poem. And poets really like to use imagery, and songwriters as well. So let's go back to the first stanza and see if we can find some imagery to highlight yellow. Mother dear, may I go downtown instead of out to play and march the streets of Birmingham in a freedom march today? Well, I really don't see a lot of imagery yet. There's not a whole lot of description. Let's check the second stanza. No, baby, no, you may not go, for the dogs are fierce and wild, and the clubs and hoses, guns and jails aren't good for a little child. All right, I can kind of see some things now. In my mind, I see the fierce and wild dogs, and I can see that because in the movie that we watched, we saw those scenes. Those black and white scenes from the news of the dogs that the police would use, and also clubs and hoses, guns and jails as well. All of those were images from the black and white scenes, and the words here in this poem help us imagine that. And then we keep reading. Um, this stanza right here, she has combed and brushed her night dark hair. I think that is a really good piece of imagery. She's getting ready for church and she's getting her hair just perfect, just right. And we can kind of see that. That night dark is a really good description of her hair. And bathed rose petals sweet is also good imagery. We can almost smell, um, you know, oops, we can almost smell her skin and how clean and pure it is. So I'm going to go back and highlight this yellow. So that's imagery. Um, Drawn white gloves upon her small brown hands. She's putting on her white gloves because it's a special day. It's Sunday school. So we can almost see that the white against her small brown hands. We can see the colors in our mind. I want you to continue the way I have done and go through the last few stanzas. And I want you to continue highlighting imagery words that you can see in your mind, that you can or you can hear, and there are more. There's plenty more. I'd like you to go through and highlight those. Pause the video, and when you're done, come back and we'll continue the assignment. All right, hopefully you found more imagery because there is more in the last few stanzas of the poem. Now I'd like to look at question number 2. It's a text connection. How is this poem connected to chapter 14 of the Watsons Go to Birmingham? That's the chapter where the church bombing happened. I want you to think about the settings, characters, and events from each text, from the book that we read and this poem. I want you to specifically tell me how they're alike. I want you to compare this poem to chapter 14. And I want you to talk about the setting and characters, okay? Pause this video now, and I want you to write at least 2 sentences to one sentence about settings and one sentence about characters. Very good. We're going to move on to number 3. This question is about the theme, and the theme is the life lesson that we can take away from a text. This poem teaches a life lesson, and just like the Watsons Go to Birmingham teaches many life lessons. So I want you to think about the topics violence and hatred. Okay, those are not themes, those are topics. What is the lesson or the theme that we can take away from this poem about violence? What can we learn about violence? And what can we learn about hatred based on what happened in this poem? And it should be a sentence, okay? What's the lesson or the theme about violence or hatred? You can pick one or the other. Put that in a complete sentence. Pause the video so you can write that in, and we will continue the assignment. All right. The next part of the assignment is I want you to click the link that I have embedded in this Hyperdoc, and it's going to take you to a video, and it's the song version of this poem. So you'll get to hear this poem set to music. And I want you to listen to it and come back and answer this last question. Does this song effectively convey the meaning? Does it communicate the meaning of the poem? Do you think it does a good job? And I want you to think about the voices that you hear, the the singer's voice. Think about the tempo. Is it fast? Is it slow? And think about the images in your mind, and also the images that you see on the screen because this is a video. And I just want you to tell me, is it a good um, version, a good song for this poem? This is kind of an opinion question, but tell me why. You can't just say yes or no. You have to tell me why. And when you're done answering this question, you can turn in this assignment so that I can give you credit for your great thinking today.